I'll record it again. I do want a response to this. So one more lecture response. It's going to be this one and the one I gave on Friday or whenever it was last week, Friday. Okay. Just because once again, a little more incentive to pay attention to it. And I enjoy responding to your comments. Some of you still didn't respond to the last one. Okay. So beware of that. All right. So, dealing with, the Civil War and right now maybe conditions of the Civil War and things like that. Let's look at the Confederate States of America, which of course were short-lived. They only existed for about 4 years, if that. 11 states total. Okay. South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, gosh dang it, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. So that's going to be your Confederate States of America. Their constitution it considers itself to be a states' rights constitution and protection of slavery in the new territories. Now, if you don't think slavery is a big deal in that constitution, you might want to take a look at it because it's in there plenty. The president is Jefferson Davis, and the capital being Richmond, Virginia. Okay, so those are Confederate States of America. So just kind of describing the sections involved in the Civil War, of course. Now, perhaps the most important states, as I've tried to stress to you already, are the border states. So let's take a look at those. The border states are slave states that remained loyal to the Union, and that includes Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and West Virginia. And they're the border states because they're right above that Mason-Dixon line. Now, West Virginia doesn't have a large vested interest in slavery or isn't going to stubbornly hold on to slavery. Remember, that's formed out of Virginia, but there are some slaves there because it's still legal there. It's just not like a huge deal, I guess, in West Virginia. Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri are going to stubbornly want to hold on to it, even when Lincoln gives them graduated compensated emancipation plans. They don't accept. So these border states are going to stubbornly hold on to slavery until the 13th Amendment. Now, why are these states a big deal? They're strategically important. Maryland is very close to the capital. Very close. I mean, it's basically where Washington, D.C. is, right? These border states also doubled the manufacturing capability to the north. And that's going to be incredibly key, maybe the key point to this war. And it also provided access to key rivers such as the Ohio and Tennessee, which allowed for troop movements and movements of supplies and things like that. So these border states are incredibly important. To quote Abraham Lincoln, right? One of his key quotes during the war is, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." So that's how important the border states were. So every decision that he makes is going to be influenced by those border states in this conflict. And I think that's key to remember when you evaluate his decisions. Here's that map again. I like to bring that up whenever I mention the states. Once again, the original secession states down here, the first 7 that seceded after Lincoln's election. And then these upper southern states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, that seceded after the firing upon Fort Sumter, which the South will fire the first shot, remember, but they do that in response to Lincoln trying to supply the troops that are basically trapped there. And then once again, here's these border states, and then these are the northern states. And all of these are Union states, right? This is the Union. This is the Confederacy down here, okay? Oh, I wanted to show you this too before I move on. I looked up this map earlier today. I just wanted to demonstrate to you, and hopefully you can see it okay, but this will help. Do you see, kids? It always floors me how close the capitals are in this conflict. Washington, D.C., Richmond. Washington, D.C., Richmond. Washington, I mean, they're pretty close to each other during the Civil War. It always kind of floors me how close they were. You can see the importance of Maryland here, West Virginia, and the border states to just protecting the capital alone. How close the battles were fought to these capitals. And of course, eventually the Union will capture the capital of Richmond. Washington, D.C. is never captured. It's threatened, it's never captured. Okay, so speaking of the border states, Maintaining border state loyalty would be key to Lincoln's political and military decisions. I feel like I've already said that 100 times. Want to bring up an example of what Lincoln does to try and maintain border state loyalty, and something that is maybe somewhat controversial, although you can constitutionally justify it. And this is probably my bias here because I am a Lincoln fan, as many people are, but Lincoln will constitutionally justify every decision he makes. Lincoln, as a president, is very concerned about doing things within constitutional boundaries. He does believe that he has greater power in times of conflict, particularly in times of rebellion. And the Constitution does have provisions for this. And one of those is suspending the writ of habeas corpus. So there's a confrontation in Baltimore. Once again, Baltimore is a key border state, key to the protection of the capital, key for troop movements, supplies, all those things. And what's happening in Baltimore is you have Confederate sympathizers. So there are some Confederate sympathizers in Maryland, Baltimore, Maryland, who are cutting telegraph lines, attempting to disrupt the movement of Union armies, waging maybe some low-key guerrilla warfare. Okay. So Lincoln feels that these people need to be jailed, that they need to be dealt with, and quickly. And so he suspends the writ of habeas corpus. Now, why is that a questionable thing? Because when you suspend the writ of habeas corpus, you're jailed indefinitely without charges. And that can be seen as, violating citizenship rights. What's one of our basic citizenship rights? Right to defend ourselves, right to a jury trial, all those things, right to appear before a judge. That's not happening here. If you're found committing, if you're a Confederate sympathizer interfering with telegraph lines or whatever going on in Maryland, Union soldiers, Union officers can jail you, and you're in jail. It's just the way it is. So you can see the potential for abuse here. But Lincoln felt like he had to do it in Baltimore, Maryland, and he felt like he was justified in doing so because the Constitution actually says you can suspend the writ of habeas corpus. When can you suspend it? When is the only time you should suspend it? Is during times of rebellion. Some of the question where the Constitution is vague is to which branch of government should suspend it. You can make an argument that this is a congressional power. Lincoln used it as an executive power in this case for two reasons: emergency powers as commander in chief, but also Congress wasn't in session, and he felt like he had to move quickly. He will enlarge the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus in 1863 against Confederate sympathizers who are trying to prevent enlistments or interfering with the draft or things like that. And so you'll see it enlarged across the northern states in 1863, and that's controversial as well. But basically what he said is this was his justification for it, which caused a lot of people to shut up. He said, must I execute? The punishment for desertion in both of these armies, kids, is execution. Okay, let me mention that for a moment. So if you flee, if you run home to the family farm and they capture you, the punishment is execution. And Lincoln tried to pardon a lot. He hated doing this. Okay, he tried to prevent as many executions as he could. But he said, must I execute soldiers who flee and allow those who try to prevent their enlistment to, run free without punishment? So once he said that, a lot of the criticism of the suspension of habeas corpus died down, but there's still some controversy to doing it. Now, other presidents have done so, and it was more controversial, arguably, when they did so, because of those times when we were at war with foreign powers, not at war with ourselves. Because the Constitution mentions rebellion, it doesn't mention like war with Germany, whatever. Okay. All right, let's talk about the advantages of both sides. And it's actually possible, if you're taking US 2, there could be some Civil War essay questions on there, since I'm not getting all the way through it during US 1. And one of those could be the advantages that either side had. Northern advantages, I think the key is a stronger centralized government. Once again, you see Lincoln acting quickly here in Baltimore, Maryland. Okay, maybe controversially, but quickly. That's an advantage in times of war. Think about all the problems that the early country was having with the Articles of Confederation and being able to defend itself and wage war. You had to ask states to send, you couldn't order troops. So you had to ask, would you please supply troops? Would you please supply money? The South is kind of framing itself under the Articles of Confederation, so we're looser centralized government. That they're going to have some of the same issues that the United States had under the Articles of Confederation. You can't do things as quickly. You can't get the money for troops. You can't get troops. It's tougher. So at least in times of war, right? We can debate whether it's good in other things or not, but at least in times of war, a stronger centralized government is usually better because quite simply you can do things more quickly, whether it's funding, supplies, or troops. And the North is going to have that. Now your text points out how the South did do some centralization of power, much more so than the states thought they were going to do, but they had more difficult. They weren't as efficient, and there was more resistance by the states. So they had to overcome those hurdles when they did do that centralization of power. Lincoln doesn't have that issue in the North. They also have a greater population, 23 states, 22 million people. That's a pretty obvious advantage. You got more people. There's more people who can be troops and support the war effort, right? The South had 11 states and 9 million people, and 5.5 million of those are going to be white people. So you can imagine the 4 million or so black people aren't as invested in Southern success as they are, right? So that's an interesting, that's quite a discrepancy there. As a matter of fact, you're going to see part of the reason for the Emancipation Proclamation is the efforts of black slaves themselves. They push Lincoln to act on the Emancipation Proclamation to some degree because they're going to flee to Union lines and they're going to have to be employed. They're going to be subject to the Confiscation Acts where they're going to be confiscated and employed in Union services. The Union armies are dealing with refugees who are fleeing the South because perhaps before anybody else did, slaves in the South were recognizing this war as a war for emancipation. And when they had the chance to leave, they left. And so you got to factor that into the population here. Most of those are going to be slaves up in the upper states and the deep southern states. Some of those slaves don't even hear about the Emancipation Proclamation until well after it's passed. But the ability of industrial production and transportation is going to favor the North. They have 90% of the nation's industrial capacity. 71% of its railroad mileage. The South only has 10% of the nation's industrial capacity and 29% of its railroad mileage. Perhaps this is the greatest advantage for the North, is its industrial capacity, right? I mean, they're just going to be able to outlast the South. Really, in some respects, once the South secedes, as long as the North is willing to wage war, they're going to lose if you look at these advantages. Okay, but credit to the South, they do hold out for a while. You got to give their troops credit and their generals, okay, militarily speaking. Northern advantages, and here's the thing, the South doesn't even have, you would think the South would have the agricultural advantage. They don't. They don't. It's the North who actually owns 75% of the nation's farms. The South owns 25%, but that's mostly cotton. Can't eat cotton. I mean, I don't even think if you put sugar on it, it'd be very good. So, so the North even has the agricultural advantage. So overall, the North is producing over 75% of the nation's wealth. That's problematic if you're trying to wage war against it in at least a civil war. Okay. Now, having said that, there are some Southern advantages. This still isn't a slam dunk. Okay. First of all, as you all know, we've talked about this before, it's always easier to defend than to invade, particularly invade a large territory. And the South is a large territory. Go back to the American Revolution. What was a key advantage of the colonies? Large territory. England had to go 3,000 miles to try and conquer a large territory and bring it back in. That's what the Union has to do with the South. The South is going to have to invade here. Or I'm sorry. The North, guys, look at the note here. The North is going to have to invade and force the South back in the Union. That's a tougher challenge than defending. Most fighting would take place in the South, and the South had advantage of knowing its territory. I mean, really, Really, the South doesn't even have to win the war. They don't really have to win it. They just have to fight the North to a draw. They just have to keep going until the North loses the will to bring it back in. Okay. Now that doesn't happen, but that, I mean, it's kind of similar to, maybe what the United States experienced with Vietnam. You guys should have some knowledge from Vietnam from your sophomore year. Why does the United States not accomplish its objective in Vietnam? Because the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, they just won't stop. They don't stop fighting. They just don't go away. And so eventually we leave. And really, that's what the South could have done. But the North will come up with a strategy that kind of ends that will, which we'll get to in a little bit. But that's an advantage. The North has to invade and bring them back in, and the South they can defend, and they know that they're going to know their territory better and all those things. And in the beginning of the war, at least according to most textbooks, your textbook, the South has more of a concrete war aim. They want to preserve their way of life. The North's war aim is to, save the Union. That's a little more abstract. Might have some people more invested in that than others. There are some people who are still like, let the South go, even after Fort Sumter. But the South believes they're preserving their way of life. Now let's look at their way of life for a moment, because to me, sometimes this is a little bit of a mystery to historians. This is tough to explain. Why did these Southern yeoman farmers fight so hard in this war when really there wasn't much in it for them? It's the planters who are getting most of the advantage from secession. Okay. Because if you look, the Southern society is very stratified. I may have showed you this in a previous lecture. It was on a slide in a previous lecture, but I can't remember if I got to it. But, the South is like a pyramid. Remember, the entire country is now, but this South is like a pyramid, right? It's very stratified. The great planters have 1% of the population. They own 20 plus slaves. Small farmers, 0 to 5 slaves. That's 35 to 45% of the population. Landless whites, 20 to 25%. Slaves, 35% of the population. Almost as large a population as the small farmers. These are the people whose secession is the most profitable for. But these are the people who are going to fight the war. Why is that? The reality is, if you want a greater redistribution of wealth, right, these people should all be united with their grievances against these people. Maybe that doesn't necessarily mean war, but it could mean political reform, right? But they're not. These people fight like dogs, fight as hard as they can in many cases throughout the Civil War. There will be a lot of desertions at the end. Okay. But they fight very hard for their generals, and their generals are good. The Southern generals are good. They're good at what they do. Okay. And it's so hard to explain. But the reality is, even though a lot of Americans don't want to face it, a lot of it comes down to race, right? Even lower class whites wanted to preserve slavery. And and they were connecting, their way of life to states' rights too, absolutely. But once again, states' rights for what? What are you preserving? Even lower class whites wanted to preserve slavery and not be on the bottom of society. They believed in those racial superiority arguments. Okay. At least I'm not them. Those are bad. Those are bad people. Those are uncivilized people. We can't let them rule, right? We can't let them have equality with us. They believed those arguments, and they will believe in those arguments for another century and beyond. Jim Crow, and to some degree, not, many Southerners are enlightened now, but some of them still have these beliefs, right? Some Northerners still have these beliefs, right? Think about the riot that just happened in our capital. I bet you if you did a study of that riot, I bet you most of the people participating in that riot, we would classify as lower to lower middle class, and probably not very well educated. And there were definitely some white supremacist groups there. Okay. That's what's happening here. People who believe that, racial hierarchy is a way to go and we got to fight for it and preserve our way of life. When the reality is, these people probably should have been uniting politically with African Americans. and therefore improving their situation, their chance at economic success and living the American dream. And that kind of happens now. I mean, a lot of the people who probably attacked the nation's capital should be uniting with African Americans who are in poverty and fighting for things to improve their condition, but instead they don't. And a lot of that comes down to race. Hopefully, something will eventually get through. Some of these things just won't go away, at least in some sectors of our society. Now, once again, the Northern war aims were more abstract. They fought to preserve the Union, but what is that? I mean, do I really want to die for that? The aims actually become more concrete after the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, once again, I don't know if you can say that every Union soldier fought to free the slaves. Most did not, and some were not happy when the Emancipation Proclamation was passed. There were Northern soldiers who weren't happy about that. They weren't fighting to free the slaves. But it does make the goal more concrete. It does seem to put the Union more on the side of right, the right side of history, so to speak. Makes them more morally right. And even Union soldiers who have some prejudice in their hearts and don't necessarily care about the slaves, they begin to recognize that this is probably the right thing to do. And it's definitely good war strategy. If you free those slaves, you're taking away a labor force from the South and they can fight with us. And the other thing that happens is the African Americans who enlist and fight for the Union, 250,000 of them, they fight very bravely. Very bravely. Perhaps they have more of a concrete aim than anybody in this war. Okay. Now, many of the white units fight incredibly bravely too. Don't get me wrong, but the African Americans that fight, they earn some respect. Okay. Now, the other Southern advantage is the officers. Many of the best officers fought with the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet, probably some others that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head. These are very good generals. And they fought in the Mexican War alongside Northern generals. And they got seasoned in what they were doing when that happened. Okay. And so early on in the war, the best leadership is on the side of the South. Now, there are two very key and skilled generals that will eventually emerge for the North. And that is Ulysses S. Grant, who, in my opinion, is one of the best generals in United States history. That's my opinion. And then William Tecumseh Sherman. And once those two emerge, then you can say the leadership swings to the other side. But it's going to take a while. Okay, let me just close with now that other set of slides is you're going to want to look at least at the beginning of those, okay, in preparation for tomorrow. Although I think most of the questions from that will probably be on your second test. But let's take a look at King Cotton. Now, the South thinks this is an advantage, and we've talked a little bit about this. Why does the South think that King Cotton is an advantage? Because Southern cotton had been traded to European nations. 75% of all raw cotton in Great Britain's factories came from the South. You would think that would be a big advantage. That's a big deal. And so as a consequence of that, Southerners gambled that the British would intervene on their side. And there are a couple key moments in the Civil War in which it looks like England just might do that. You can make an argument that Robert E. Lee screws up a couple times. And how does he screw up? He invades the North. Remember, I said a key advantage for the South is they don't have to invade the North. The North has to invade them. The South just has to defend. But Robert E. Lee, twice during the war, decides to invade. And at Antietam and at Gettysburg. What are the reasons for that? Well, he's hoping that maybe he can end the war more quickly by doing that and Northern resolve. And if he has those successes, he believes that England will recognize them and help them out, ally with them, or at least help them. So that's why he invades. And England was maybe going to recognize the South and help the South as late as Gettysburg. But when Lee loses Gettysburg, turning point battle in the war, that is no longer going to happen. And so the question is, why did King Cotton fail? Well, number one, you can't eat cotton. The North still controlled most of the agriculture in the country. But British factories already had surpluses of raw cotton. So Britain could wait a while to make their decision. Notice I said Gettysburg was late. And the other factor there is Britain knew it didn't have the support of its people in going in for the South. And a lot of that was due to Uncle Tom's Cabin. Maybe you remember me mentioning that. Most British commoners, common people, right? They didn't support the South. They didn't support slavery. Okay. And the other thing is, England's a huge empire still in this time period. Not as big as they once were, but they still have India. They still have Egypt. And guess what? They got a lot of cotton. So, in other words, England can last a while, or it can turn to other sources for its cotton before it has to turn to the South. Okay. And then once again, as I just mentioned, once Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, the war to free slaves, now England is really like, okay, now if we decide to support the South, we're going to be morally wrong here. We ended slavery in 1830. We probably shouldn't support a slave power. And now the North is stating it's going to liberate the slaves in the South. Our people support that. We are still somewhat, England is a republic. We need to support the people. So good luck to you, South. Doesn't look good for you. Okay. So those are the reasons that King Cotton fails. Okay. And you may have some questions related to that on your test in the next 2 days. Okay. So kids, your test is multiple choice. You'll have those notes you can use. Okay. Once again, I would examine them at least some tonight, so you know where you can find the stuff. All right. Any questions? All right, guys. Now tomorrow, just remember when you take a test, I'm going to need to see your screens while you're testing. You'll have 45 minutes if needed. Okay. 45 minutes if needed with me tomorrow. If you don't need that long, that's fine. Okay. All right. Have a good day, kids. I'll see you tomorrow.